warfare as we've known it, but where are we going? Currently, General Petraeus is a partner at KKR, chairman of the KKR Global Institute, and chairman of KKR Middle East, and he's doing many other things. However, very briefly, he graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, earning the General George C. Marshall Award at the top graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and got his Master's in Public Administration and PhD in International Relations from Princeton. And his doctoral dissertation focused on the American military and the lessons of Vietnam. Over 37 years, we well remember General Petraeus as in the military, U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands and his general command of the surge in Iraq and command of the U.S. Central Command and Command of Coalition Forces in Afghanistan. By a vote of 94-0 in the Senate, he then served as director of the CIA during a period of significant achievements in the global war on terror. He has a number of other achievements. We could really spend several minutes doing that, but he's currently the Kissinger Fellow at Yale University's Jackson School, Senior Vice President of the Royal United Services Institute, and a member of the Trilateral Commission, Council of Foreign Affairs, and Aspen Strategy Group, as well as a member of the boards of the Atlantic Council, Institute for the Study of War, Iraq and Afghanistan, Veterans of War, and numerous other veterans service organizations. He's been named one of America's 25 best leaders by U.S. News and World Report, a runner for Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Oh, there's several here. I highlighted 4 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, 2 NATO Meritorious Service Medals, the Master Command Action Badge. He's been decorated by 14 foreign countries, but I think the one he probably likes the best may be the only person possibly, while in uniform, throwing out the first pitch for the World Series and did a coin toss for the Super Bowl. Now, this evening, he is going to talk about his book, which most of you got the book. We thank you very much. As his experience and everything within his life, drawing on all that, and also working with a prize-winning historian, Andrew Roberts, explores 70 years of conflict, drawing significant lessons and insights from their analysis of the past, how mistakes have been repeated, and the challenge of learning to adapt to various new weapon systems, theories, and strategies. And moderating the program this evening, we have our very own Dr. Ken Holland, who's on the board, also the Indiana Council of World Affairs. He will moderate the program in a discussion with the general, and then by 6:45, we are going to go into something that we know you are really anticipating, and that is going to be the public Q&A. So we're quite excited about that. We're going to aim for 6:40, hopefully do that, and the general will have an opportunity to cover more. As far as Ken is concerned, he worked with General Petraeus in Afghanistan and was the commander of the International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces. Dr. Holland was the senior civilian advisor to NATO for building the rule of law in Afghanistan. He's a Vietnam War Army veteran, spent 13 years implementing various projects in Afghanistan for the World Bank, NATO, U.S. Defense Department, USAID, and the State Department, and also was the president of the American University of Afghanistan. So, Dr. Holland, will you please begin our program this evening in your conversation with General Petraeus? And again, thank you so much for joining us. We know, General, that your schedule right now is tight. So thank you for staying with us and being with us this evening.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for me to reconnect with General Petraeus. We worked very closely together, as Betty said, in Afghanistan. General Petraeus, I just would like to point out the significance of your book. It's a New York Times, USA Today, Amazon, and Publishers Weekly bestseller, and has been named Book of the Year by several outlets, including Aspects of History and Modern War Institute. So we're so grateful to you for taking the time to talk to us about your book. So my first question, and for those of you in the audience, if you do have a question for the general, please post it in the chat box, and then Ray Montagno will collect your questions, and he'll be able to ask those to the general later in the program. My first question, General Petraeus, is in recent interviews, you have praised the raid that ended in the capture of Nicolas Maduro this weekend as a truly remarkable demonstration of American military power and an extraordinarily impressive display of skill and scale. So, what advice would you give the Trump administration as it contemplates next steps and long term plans regarding Venezuela? And what lessons could be drawn from our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of experience, a lot of lessons that should be taken. But first of all, it's just a pleasure to be with you all, to be with the World Affairs Council of Indiana, and to be reunited with Ken, who did so much for Afghanistan over such a long period of time, but particularly when he was helping the rule of law task force that was established under my command. And then later, when he was the president of the American University of Afghanistan, one of the really great institutions. We're very proud of it. My wife and I personally funded a scholarship for an Afghan woman every year. Still do support it, even though obviously it's no longer in that wonderful campus that was built in Kabul to house it. But again, thanks for all of that service. And thanks for doing this evening. I think that one of the biggest lessons of the invasion of Iraq, and I was a two-star during that, commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division during the fight to Baghdad, and then the subsequent first year there, was obviously that we were not prepared for the post-combat phase. The phase 4, as it's called, the stabilization phase of operations. And it's not clear to me that we have a particularly comprehensive and well-developed plan in this case either. Uh, Again, I would just highlight this operation was absolutely extraordinary. The fact that we could carry it out without the loss of a single American in uniform, without losing any aircraft. One was hit, some soldiers were wounded, but not life-threatening. To bring together 150 aircraft launched from 20 different locations
Wow.
in the Western Hemisphere, to orchestrate all of that, to synchronize it, coordinate it, and carry out this operation so impressively. Keep in mind that this is a guy who had a lot of security around him, who had a safe house that he was unable to get into, or a safe room, and who had Cuban advisors even, who supposedly were extremely competent, and many of those, I suspect, ended up in the sights of the weapons carried by our special mission units as they conducted this operation in the middle of the night. The question now, obviously, is going forward. The president has said we're going to run Venezuela. I think that's probably not entirely accurate. By the way, what are the ground rules for this? Are we on Chatham House rules? Because I saw we're filming this. Can somebody tell me what the ground rules
Yeah.
are? Is this going to be
Uh,
posted online
Uh,
for viewing by everybody? In which case, I have to say that I'll be a bit more guarded.
we could, Ray, would you care to respond?
Yes, this will get posted on YouTube.
Okay.
So with our
So,
other, yeah.
um, the president has said that we're going to run Venezuela. I think, in truth, what is going to run Venezuela is the regime established by Maduro, now led by his former vice president, now the acting president, who was quite defiant initially in her response to the U.S. operation, and now is appearing to be considerably more compliant, if you will. So the question is then, how are you going to run the country through a regime, noting, of course, that it lost the election of 2024 by a margin of nearly 2-1. And that's fact. There's real evidence of the outcome of that election. They actually got all the polling materials to justify that particular assessment. That was not accepted, of course, by Maduro. And what is the comprehensive, integrated plan for what it is that the United States wants to see done there. Will it culminate in either an election, a free and fair election? And of course, that one that was conducted by the Maduro regime was sufficiently free and fair that he was defeated by, again, a 2-to-1 margin. Will it culminate in an election and the establishment of a democratic government, or will it culminate in putting in place the individual who was elected in the election of 2024, who was essentially the representative of Machado, the recent Nobel Prize laureate, because she was not allowed to run. Of course, he's not in the country. He apparently is in exile in Spain, and I'm not sure where she is at this point, having traveled back from the ceremony in which she received the Nobel Prize. So where is the comprehensive team that is going to carry all this out? Will there be an embassy established? One presumably would think that it would be very, very helpful to have that on the ground with experts in all of the different areas, such as we have had in the embassies in the war zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, others. If you go back and think about the operations, say in Panama, where our soldiers were killed, could be billed as much more of a self-defense operation. Noriega had not allowed the lawfully elected president to actually take office. He was sworn in the first day of that operation in 1989. You can go back to Grenada. You can even go to 1994 in Haiti, where General Cedras was persuaded that he should take exile rather than have the 82nd Airborne Division, which was about an hour out from jumping onto the international airport there, before he said, yes, perhaps it's best that I leave the country. But in all of these cases, then we've had to establish a U.S. element, sometimes a coalition element, that then looks at the different areas of all of the elements of governance and begins to instruct those elements on what it is that we want to see achieved. Secretary Rubio has been pretty clear, actually, that he sees the end result as, again, either a democratic election or perhaps the installation of those who were elected back in 2024. But what's the timeline for all of this? Where is that multifaceted team with all of the expertise in the different areas that are needed to use the influence that we have, which is very, very considerable at this point in time? The former vice president, now acting president, of course, obviously could contemplate a fate similar to her president, who, by the way, again, keep in mind that we offered him several opportunities to go into exile in Turkey and other countries, and he obviously foolishly turned those down. But going forward, again, what are the big ideas that will guide this? What is seen as the culmination of the effort there? To what will we hand off, having orchestrated, but through a regime? And it's not clear, of course, whether the regime will stay together, whether there will be infighting that begins as they realize that they're basically negotiating themselves out of their positions, keeping in mind that both the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Interior are under indictment as well and have sizable bounties on their heads. Presumably, this kind of thing can be negotiated away. There can be agreements for them and so on. But this is going to be an extraordinarily complex task. And again, the sooner we can see what structure is going to be established, presumably in the capital, presumably with a reopened embassy, and so forth, I think the better, to give us a sense of what it is that we're going to strive to achieve there, which obviously is a good bit bigger than just reinvigorating the oil industry or getting rid of the Cubans, Iranians, perhaps some of the Chinese influence, and so forth. Back to you, Ken.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. General Petraeus. You and I were both involved in trying to build liberal democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was particularly involved because of you with trying to build the rule of law. Could you maybe talk a little bit about why you think the rule of law is so important, was so important to both the Iraq and the Afghan missions? And could you talk about why it was so important for the military to take the lead in this effort and not civilian organizations such as USAID?
Sure. First, let me just note that in each of these cases, um, there were very, very tough times. Obviously, at the end of the day, of course, our patience ran out in Afghanistan, and I disagreed with the decision to withdraw our forces. I thought that the effort in Afghanistan was very sustainable. And whether you can continue your commitment in a situation depends on its sustainability. And sustainability, frankly, is measured in the expenditure of your blood and your treasure. And Ken, I felt very strongly that we could easily sustain what we were doing there. We hadn't lost a soldier in combat in 18 months, and the cost was somewhere around $25 billion out of an $800 to $850 billion defense budget. All of our allies wanted to stay. And it was obvious to me, at least, that the outcome, if we departed, was not going to be a good one. I said that we would come to regret that decision, and I certainly hope we have, because the country is obviously vastly worse off under the Taliban once again than it was, however flawed the government was that we were supporting and so forth. But when it comes to Iraq, there's often discussion about the failed effort to build Iraq. Actually, I was just back in Baghdad, and I wish that all those that served there could have been with me to see what is really extraordinary development, incredible infrastructure. What used to be the most dangerous road in the world from the airport to the green zone is a showpiece now. The airport's everything has been rebuilt. The expansion of Baghdad is very impressive. Yes, there's all kinds of bureaucratic problems, corruption, political nepotism, you name it. But frankly, I was thinking as I was actually driving down what used to be the most dangerous road in the world to the Prime Minister's guest house after arriving there, every single Prime Minister who was elected since 2003 is actually still alive. That's not a trivial accomplishment in that part of the world. And the Prime Minister has resulted from a democratically conducted election. There's no shortage of probably of improprieties here and there. There have been very lengthy periods to establish who will be the prime minister, and that likely will be the case again with the election that took place a few days after I was there a few months ago. But that country actually is limping along, stumbling along, and compared to some of the alternatives, some of the countries for which we had great hope in the wake of the Arab Spring and so forth, it is actually, again, progressing. Touch wood, the Iranian influence is still very considerable. There's political dysfunction in the Kurdish region, as well as certainly in Baghdad to a degree. But by and large, for all of the challenges there, and they were innumerable, and the mistakes made on our side and on the Iraqi side, actually that particular experiment is certainly still progressing. Why did I support the rule of law efforts in both countries, I should add? And Mark Martins, the brilliant brigadier general, first in the class at West Point, Rhodes Scholar, double first at Oxford, Harvard Law Review, and could run with me and was my legal counsel, I think, 5 different times in meaningful assignments, 2 years in Iraq and 2 years in Afghanistan. We felt very, very strongly that, again, if we are a nation of laws and try to observe the law, not always without flaws, as in Abu Ghraib, a grave violation of the Geneva Convention and law of land warfare, but by and large striving to do that. Again, that you need to have that rule of law. If these wars, and the same will be true in Venezuela and any country, if you're trying to achieve the support of the people, again, the governance has to seem impartial, responsible, and in accordance with the rule of the law. And we sought to do that with respect to the detention facilities in Iraq. the judicial system, and indeed the police. These are the three legs of the rule of law. By the way, if any one of those legs is weak, you can see that the rule of law stool can fall over. We sought to do the same in Afghanistan, though frankly, the situation in Afghanistan was vastly, vastly more difficult than that in Iraq for a variety of reasons we could go into later, but which led me, after Secretary Rumsfeld asked me to do an assessment of Afghanistan on my way home from my three-star tour in Iraq, to say that Afghanistan was going to be the longest of the long wars. Again, the complexity there was much, much greater. But nonetheless, we sought to establish, as you'll recall, rule of law that was actually in line with the traditional justice system of Afghanistan, and not to impose our system on top of it. And so this meant the hook style of justice, where sheikhs and other local leaders would actually codify or capture the results, the outcomes of the local exercise of the rule of law, essentially disputes, resolution of disputes, capture that, and then ensure that it's recorded in the provincial element of the Ministry of Justice, and so forth on up the line, to ensure that the conditions in prisons were reasonable within, again, the conditions possible in Afghanistan. In each case, we also reformed our own detention facilities, and these were massive efforts. In Iraq, we had over 27,000 detainees, and I had to shut down the release of any detainees for about 6 months because we realized that our detention facilities were actually terrorist training camps, as the then JSOC commander observed one time. In other words, that we had extremists that were so extreme that they were radicalizing the other detainees, and we had to identify who they were, the most significant of the extremists, go in, pull them out of the population, put them in maximum security, and then and only then could you carry out basic education courses, reform of their extremist thinking, moderation in religion, brick making, bread making, a whole bunch of other things that ultimately over time actually became quite interesting and fun, because we drove the recidivism rate down from well over 90%, in other words, 90% returning to our facilities after they were released, to well under 5% during the course of the surge in Iraq alone. But the effort in why it had to be undertaken by the military in both countries, in truth, but especially in Afghanistan, was because the country, as you'll recall, that was responsible for the judicial system, another country that was responsible for the police system, and so forth, were not doing their job. And we discussed this with these countries. This was a result of agreements in the very beginning in Afghanistan, where they divvied up these different tasks. And it was very clear that the country that was responsible for the judicial system had a minimal amount of people. I think it was less than 10 on the ground, whereas we had this very, very powerful and capable military force with lots of lawyers to draw on, including at the head of them, again, this Brigadier General Mark Martins, a true American hero, who had even worked for the Department of Justice at a period of time when he was a full colonel before being promoted. And so we had the capabilities. We welcomed what these different countries provided to us, which was very minimal. But then we identified the importance of this, did an audit of all of the detention facilities under the control of the Afghans, having already gotten our own house in order, then set about improving, establishing the standards for them, then holding them accountable for those standards, and then doing the same in the judicial system as well, we were already in charge of the training of the Afghan police. Now, again, the challenges were enormous because, as you'll recall, there was a very high level of illiteracy. There was very little infrastructure. There was no Afghan money. The enemy had sanctuaries in the neighboring country, Pakistan. The economy was fairly anemic, and on and on and on. Nonetheless, this is a task that we needed to take on and hadn't taken on until we actually conducted the buildup there, at which time I was privileged to take command we got the strategy right by that point in time. General McChrystal deserves credit for that. For the first time, it took us 8 years to get the big ideas right, another year to get the inputs right to enable the conduct of the big ideas. But tragically, the US administration had already announced in the build-up speech something with which I disagreed. The day when we would begin the drawdown, telling an enemy with whom we were in a contest of wills that we wanted to draw down and that we were always trying to leave, and therefore undermining that component of the struggle between the two warring factions. Nonetheless, it was important, as were another of other initiatives that we undertook. You'll remember we had Brigadier General H.R. McMaster. I brought him in, having also used him in Iraq during the surge, but in this case to establish a anti-corruption task force with the Afghans. And this had very significant results. It resulted in the sacking of the Air Force Chief of Staff, the Surgeon General, the head of the military hospital in Kabul, and many, many others. And again, this was a joint effort together between me and President Karzai, facilitated by General McMaster and an Afghan counterpart. We took on the anti-narcotics for the first time with a comprehensive and coalition effort. The problem was that it had taken far too long to do this. We should have done it back when we had very, very low levels of violence. Should have done much, much more at the outset when the Taliban was shattered and regrouping over in Pakistan, something that took them a good more than 5 to 7 years. And we could have done so much more. But of course, as is well known, we shifted our focus to Iraq, and then I became part of the problem because we needed everything we had for the conduct of the surge to pull a country out of a Sunni Shia civil war that was reaching terrifying levels of violence. And we did. And our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines deserve enormous credit, along with the civilians, the diplomats, the development workers, the spies, and so forth, for helping to pull that country out of a civil war and driving violence down by nearly 90% in the 18 months of the surge. And it continued to go down for the subsequent 3.5 years until we withdrew our final combat forces, with which I also disagreed. But it was done, and tragically, the Iraqi president pursued a highly sectarian set of actions that began the process of tearing the country apart, allowed the Islamic State to reconstitute. And you recall what happened after that. But ultimately, that was dealt with. Several good prime ministers in Iraq have held that country together, overseen very considerable progress, a lot of it because we helped them rebuild the entire oil industry and electricity and so forth. But again, that's the tale of those two endeavors, and there are lots of lessons there for what we're doing now in Venezuela, as there are from, again, our interventions in all the way back to the Bay of Pigs in the early Kennedy administration, Dominican Republic in 1965 under President Johnson, Grenada under President Reagan, Panama under President George H.W. Bush, and Haiti under President Clinton.
Great. Thank you, General Petraeus. In the book, you mentioned that post-1945 conflicts have been different from those before that period, and that before 1945, often when there was a war, there was a victor and then there was a defeated enemy. One side won and one side lost. But you point out in the book that since 1945, many conflicts kind of drag on and don't really end in any decisive conclusion. Think of the conflict, say, between India and Pakistan, or between Israel and the Palestinians, or North Korea and South Korea. So why do you think we have so many frozen conflicts that don't seem capable of reaching a decisive resolution of victory and defeat?
Well, there have been limits on warfare ever since 1945. The bottom line is that we used nuclear weapons, of course, to accelerate the resolution of the war in the Pacific. They've never been used since, but the specter of use of nuclear weapons has been so significant that it has at times prevented going farther. It was, of course, threatened to be used in Korea. The Chinese came in, we did not use it. There was eventually essentially an armistice, a cessation of hostilities that has been uh, a frozen conflict, if you will. We thought, of course, that the situation in Ukraine was a frozen conflict from 2014 until 2022, and that obviously proved not to be the case. But you have a fairly stable situation on the Korean Peninsula at this point in time. The U.S. presence there still of well over 20,000 troops. I think it's 28,000. I was just in Korea recently as well. Has been a very stabilizing feature of that. And I really don't see the North being tempted. They're not suicidal at the end of the day, even with having nuclear weapons. Then the others, though, you have to look at each of those. And the truth is that Israel Palestinian issue has not been a frozen conflict. Obviously, you had the element of Palestinians in Gaza who carried out a horrific barbaric attack on 10/7, reignited war in the region, actually. At one point in time, Israel was fighting war on 6 or 7 different fronts, depending on your counting rules. Of course, did a magnificent job against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Very impressive strikes against Iran, together with the help of the United States for the final 24 hours, setting that nuclear program back. I would assess years, though there's the possibility of some highly enriched uranium and advanced centrifuges being somewhere. If they are, I think they'll eventually be discovered and they will be destroyed as well. And it's very possible Israel will carry out strikes this year against Iran to set back further the efforts to reconstitute its missile threat, which is a very significant issue for the Israelis, because even with the success of their very impressive air and ballistic missile defense system, our contribution to it with the Theater High Altitude Area Defense System, we launched about $1.2 billion worth of interceptors from that alone in that 12-day war. And then all of our ships and aircraft and all the other systems throughout the Gulf states contributing, there was still about 5% of those missiles that got through and did very considerable damage. But of course, it could have been vastly worse, and they're very worried about that. So we're back into a bit of, again, a somewhat more stable arrangement with respect to Hezbollah, although I think Israel will insist on Hezbollah being disarmed this time. And if the Lebanese government won't do it under our pressure and their pressure, they may have to take more action there. They will ensure that Iran is not able to reconstitute its military capability or nuclear program. They're going to obviously continue to keep issues under control on the West Bank, but the challenge really comes to Gaza. And this is where, and I've been quite public with this. You recall that in the book, Ken, we set out in the introduction the intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership, that at the very top of a military campaign, which I developed before I went back for the 4-star tour in Iraq. And it has 4 seemingly simple tasks: get the big ideas right, craft the right strategy, communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and to all who have a stake in the outcome of the endeavor, whether it's business or war, oversee the implementation of the big ideas, what we normally think of as leadership, the provision of energy, inspiration, example, hiring the best and brightest, letting those not measuring up to move on to something else, the organizational architecture that you establish for the conduct of the endeavor, the metrics you use, how you spend your time, your battle rhythm is crucial. And on that battle rhythm are events that enable you and force you to perform the 4th task, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, to modify the strategy as the situation evolves so that you can do it again and again and again. This works very much in business. I have a great example with Netflix, or we can do it with KKR, which in my watch alone has grown from 83 billion to nearly 720 billion in assets under management because of additional great big ideas and very impressive strategic leadership. In the case of Gaza, the strategy that's been established for a variety of reasons most particularly probably the political elements of the coalition that supports Prime Minister Netanyahu, the approach of clear an area, go in and kill a bunch of bad guys, destroy as much infrastructure of them as you can. Unfortunately, there are going to be civilians in the way during this, and then leave, clear and leave as it's termed, allows the bad guys, Hamas, to reconstitute. And so Hamas at this point in time is still roughly the same strength they were before, nowhere near the same capability. All of the colonels and generals have been killed at this point in time, and their successors get killed periodically as well. But in terms of who's governing Gaza, to the extent that anyone is, the area of the people, because the Israelis are controlling about 50%, but it's not at all populated. Hamas is the most guys with the most guns. So if you look at the original three objectives of the Israelis, only one has actually been achieved. And that was thanks to President Trump really using his influence with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and indirectly with the Houthis, or I'm sorry, with Hamas, to get the hostages back. And that was a very significant achievement, to be sure. But there were two other major objectives with which I agreed. I wanted to see Israel achieve these objectives of destroying Hamas and keeping Hamas from governing again. Hamas is degraded, but by no means destroyed. And to the extent that anyone is governing Gaza, it is unfortunately Hamas. I actually felt there should have been a fourth objective, which is to provide a better future for the Palestinian people without Hamas in their lives. But the only way to achieve all four of these objectives from the outset was by conducting what's called clear, hold, build, slowly transition operations, what we did during the surge in Iraq. In fact, prior to the surge, we were conducting clear and leave operations, and the results were as unsatisfactory as they have been in Gaza. A lot of bad guys killed, but the minute you leave or hand off to Iraqis who couldn't hold the areas, the bad guys would come back. We shifted to clear, hold, build. We had gated communities, we called them, walls, entry control points, very sophisticated use of biometric ID cards. You clear every building, floor, room, cellar, plug every tunnel entrance in the case of Gaza, where there is so much underground infrastructure, which makes this the most challenging urban operations in history by far. But the way to go about it would be to conduct sequential, clear, hold, build operations with walls, with gated communities, as we term them. We told the people in Fallujah that it costs a lot of money to live in a gated community in Florida, and we're giving it to you for free. We did about 12 or 13 gated communities in Fallujah alone, a city of only about 250 to 300,000 people, by that time having put a wall around the entire city to begin with. So that would have been the way to go here. And again, the focus always has to be on, are you getting the big ideas right? If there are any in the audience who served in Vietnam, we all celebrate the extraordinarily selfless service of those of that time, the courage, the innovativeness, the determination, esprit, and so forth. But at the end of the day, our leaders failed you, because we didn't get the big ideas right for 13 long years. We tried to win a war of attrition against the Viet Cong and the insurgents in South Vietnam and the North Vietnamese regular forces when it was clear we could not. And we should have focused on security of the people from the beginning, which is what the South Vietnamese asked us to do. Shortly after the French left, we came in and the country was partitioned north and south. And it wasn't until well after the Tet Offensive in late 1968 that General Abrams finally crafted the right strategy, but by then it was far too late. And that was a war that was, as I mentioned earlier, unsustainable. So what is the biggest overall lesson out of the book Conflict? It should be that you've got to get the big ideas right. And this is what we should look to see when it comes to Venezuela. What are the big ideas here? How is it that the U.S. is going to exercise its influence using, apparently, the regime whose leader we have snatched in a very legitimate law enforcement operation? And I'm pleased to see him brought to justice, just as I was when I was the commander in Afghanistan And you were also there the night that Osama bin Laden was brought to justice and so forth. But it always comes down to the big ideas. And again, as soon as we can get clarity with those, I think it'll be better for our country and also for the Venezuelan people to have some sense of where it is that we are hoping to guide that country and what the ultimate outcome, just in very broad terms, would look like. And if you want to
Thank
go
you,
to
General.
questions from the audience, I'd be happy to take them, Ray. One at a time, though, please.
Ray?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. And actually, we have a series of questions. And actually, Jim Strick, you were kind of first on our list here. So, Jim, you want to go ahead and ask your question? Unmute yourself.
I mean, if you actually have them given to you in text, it's actually easier if you just read it, Ray, because the unmuting and all the rest of that is going to consume a lot of time.
Okay. Well, I'll read your question. Is there a genuine indication that the long-term intent is to support a democratic Venezuela or not merely take over the country's oil industry?
Oh, I think the intent is far more than taking over the oil. And keep in mind, we can't take over an oil industry. It's going to function in accordance with market forces at the end of the day. And frankly, investors are not going to flock back in until there is a sense of what the rule of law will be, what the rules of investing will be, and so forth and so on. So there's going to, as was the case, as we tried to get investors to come into Iraq or Afghanistan or other conflict zones, and that will be the case here. But I think that Secretary Rubio's statements have very heavily implied that the end result is going to be some form of democratically elected government. The question is, how do you get from here to there? Is it going to be those who were elected in 2024 by a 2-to-1 margin, or is it going to be those who are elected by an election that is going to be conducted, presumably, under the auspices of the regime whose leader we have just snatched out of the country and arraigned in a courthouse in New York?
Okay. Well, thank you. Don has a kind of a follow-up question. Don Dorsey?
Ray, are there text messages to read?
I'm sorry.
Again, I think far better, Ray, if you just read the text message to
Okay.
me.
Sure.
My screen says the chat is disabled, so I'm not able to enter a question.
Ah, okay. Well, let me read Don's question. Are there international laws that govern what we are doing in Venezuela, specifically bombing boats, abducting Maduro?
Sure. And there's a healthy debate about whether it is legal or not. Keep in mind that what is coming out of Venezuela is what is coming from Colombia. This is coca and processed cocaine. Sadly, Colombia is producing the highest ever coca and cocaine in their history, well beyond even the Medellin cartel days. I have a lot of insights on this because the CI director partners very closely with authorities there, including the president of the country. We had Colombia down to under 30,000 hectares of cultivation of coca. It's well over 200,000 hectares now. It's the highest ever, as I said. And a lot of that is flowing out, again, through Venezuela, then into the Caribbean, and then on to Europe and or to the United States. In the past, this obviously was dealt with as a judicial, legal issue. Certainly military support was always involved. There's a longstanding joint task force that supported typically the Coast Guard and DEA and others in carrying that out. The decision obviously has been made to use military force and to strike these vessels, and there's a very healthy debate about that that I would encourage folks to look at. And there's also already healthy debate about the international legal status of what it is that we have done. And in fact, various of our American leaders have focused on either the law enforcement operation, which I think does stand on its own, to detain Maduro and then to bring him to justice again in New York, and he'll face a trial there, presumably. The other actions, again, there's a healthy debate about that, as there was, frankly, in the wake of Grenada. In fact, I was in graduate school at the time of the Grenada invasion. The commander of it came and spoke there. I was taking a course on international law at that time and wrote a paper that was titled "The Invasion of Grenada: Illegal, Immoral, and the Right Thing to Do." It was debatable in international legal terms, although there were some fundamental justifications. There were U.S. citizens at a medical school that were in harm's way potentially. But the truth is, it was also a regime that was cozying up with the communists at a time of the Cold War, and that was seen as a bit of an excuse to get rid of that regime. Candidly, an awful lot in the wake of these operations depends on what the outcome is. Panama, which had a reasonable legal underpinning because we'd actually had one or two Americans killed at a checkpoint by the forces, and the forces had failed to install the legally elected president and so forth. But again, this was also to get rid of that individual and to eliminate his control of the security forces of the country. But it turned out really well. And I don't think there is much second guessing about the results of that. I would submit that the same is true with respect to Grenada. Haiti, obviously, it did get rid of this abusive dictator, Cedras, but what followed over the years after that, especially as we just didn't have the fortitude to stay with it as a country and together with the United Nations, meant that it is back in a very dire situation right now. So again, I think a great deal will result from what is the outcome of this, some not just weeks or months, but years down the road. But in the meantime, there is going to be a healthy intellectual debate, legal debate about it, and it's already begun in the United Nations and elsewhere.
Well, kind of a follow-up question from that, from Larry Cimino, is theoretically, what do you think the U.S. response would be if a NATO operation diverted Air Force One to The Hague and held President Trump for trial for war crimes in the International Criminal Court?
With all due respect, I just don't even think that is even remotely plausible, and therefore it's the kind of hypothetical that you generally don't pursue.
Okay. Well, the second part of his question is, what is your opinion on the rights of service members to refuse to execute illegal orders?
Look, service members at all levels, again, have rules of engagement, for example, all the way down at the bottom. As you go higher and higher, there's a bit more influence and latitude. But at the end of the day, we're a country that cherishes the rule of law, and those in uniform strive to abide by it.
So there's a follow-up question to that, kind of with respect to the bombing of the boats in the Caribbean. How does that, this is from Charlie Wiles, how do you justify the extrajudicial bombing of boats in the Caribbean and the support of the rule of law?
I'm not sure it's extrajudicial, and I haven't seen the tapes, and I can't comment on the decision. That the most, I think, debated decision was the second engagement of one of the early boat strikes. And without seeing that, without understanding whether they were incapacitated and all the rest of that, I'm not going to second guess those that I was privileged to serve with in combat over a number of years. Again, there's a legal foundation for what is done. It can be debated, and it is being debated and has been debated.
Okay. So Adrian,
I might just point out my PhD is in economics and international relations, not international law.
Sure.
And so I try to stay within the bounds of my expertise.
Got it. Thank you. This is from Adrian Petraeus. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Adrian. Sir General, could you please kindly comment on, in quotes, copycats of the U.S. role it took in Venezuela, possibly manifest in two ways. Other countries' oppositions playing "the U.S. will come and get you," as some voices in Romania are playing currently. Or two, fear of the U.S. intervention in countries with perfectly democratic elected governments, but which may simply not be liked by our current administration. Are these valid concerns? What guarantees have we against those? Thank you.
Let me just answer it this way. I think that this operation actually does give the administration greater power and influence to a degree in certain other situations in the hemisphere, and perhaps more broadly. I'm not one who thinks that we're about to invade Greenland or something like that. But again, keep in mind that President Trump's negotiating style is to, even before you sit down at the table, punch the other guy in the nose. This is in his book. This is not hidden. He espouses this approach, and this is a manifestation of that. One can question that. One can question the effects that it has on long-standing ties and so forth, but it also can often get very considerable results. The fact is that NATO countries, I watched as presidents of either party. When I was a 3-star and 4-star, I was a NATO guy as a 3-star and a 4-star, also as a 1-star, dual-hatted in each case. And our presidents, our secretaries of defense railed about the inadequate spending on defense by our NATO allies. And frankly, it is not until this past year where President Trump really leaned on them. Obviously, he had the help of the threats posed by Russia and the more overt activities that Russia has taken against them, whether it's cable cutting or incursion by drones or assassinations or disinformation, you name it. But the result is that for the first time, NATO countries are not only going to meet the 2% of GDP on defense, they've increased the goal to 3.5%. Again, you can disagree with the tactics, techniques, and procedures here, but the results speak for themselves. And that is hugely heartening. Yes, it's also because there are questions about whether the United States will do what we have always pledged we will do. But again, I'd keep in mind that a lot of this is preliminary negotiating tactics. We may want better rights to minerals, rare earths, basing in Greenland, where we already do have a base, by the way, and where there are arrangements already. But if so, I think this will make it easier to get what it is that we want. The country I'd be watching, by the way, is not any one of those that have been talked about, like Colombia or Mexico or certainly Greenland, but really Cuba. I think Cuba is in a very difficult situation as a result of the operation in Venezuela, because essentially Venezuela has been sending them crude oil in return for Cuba sending doctors and intelligence officers and even the personal security detail that was provided that proved so inept in securing President Maduro. That is the country I'd keep an eye on. It has a failing economy already. Its electrical grid is about to collapse. The economy is in shambles. Of course, the approach that they have had is barely surviving. In fact, the only injection of hard currency is really in areas where they actually allow some degree of free market activity, but they keep lids on that. That is what I'd watch, and that'll be very interesting. It's also the country, of course, in which our Secretary of State and National Security Advisor has long had a very keen interest, coming from South Florida, and given his roots and so forth. And I think that bears very careful watching, because there are, again, huge implications for Cuba if among the actions that we direct the regime to carry out includes ceasing the export of oil to Cuba which is a real lifeline for them. And that will be a very interesting, again, development to watch. One last question, please. But you've warmed
Sure.
me up really well for Anderson Cooper and CNN in about 10
All
minutes.
right. Okay, Pierre Atlas has a question, and Pierre, you want to? It's kind of a long question, so I'll let you.
Well, if it's a long question, then we probably better go to a short one because I really do have to cut it off. And again, the best is if you read the text rather than
Well, okay, I'll
or
skip
summarize it
I'll skip
quickly.
to a different one here. How do conflicts in Yemen, Libya, Sudan, and Somalia reveal the Gulf states in the modern proxy warfare? And does this involvement signal a new era in conflict or diffusion of Cold War?
No, I just think it reflects different interests by different countries in the Gulf and beyond, I would add, who have the resources to enable the factions they're supporting, which in many cases are on opposite sides. In fact, within Yemen, it's actually within the faction that was formerly supported by the UAE and Saudi Arabia together, but now there's been a fracture within that. So instead of being united by opposition to the Houthis, which are supported by Iran, of course, you now have actually internecine conflict between the two different elements in the southern part of that country. So again, that's really what is going on here. And you see it in Sudan, you see it in the Horn of Africa, you see it actually in North Africa and Libya. There are other countries that are involved there. It also, in some cases, includes Turkey. Russia has been active in some of these, although it's now much more preoccupied by Ukraine. But you see, again, countries with the means and the interests to support elements of their choosing, which in some cases is in conflict with what others are supporting. And really, a bit illustrative of what we see around the world in a number of different locations, well beyond Africa. And we may see more of that. If you see a greater degree of bipolarity in the world, as what in many respects, but not entirely at all, is a new Cold War between the United States and China in this case, although we have enormous economic exchange, a huge difference from the situation of the original Cold War, where the U.S. did very, very little economically and in trade terms with the USSR. But that is among the complexities of a world in which I think there is a greater number of threats and challenges and issues for the United States and our allies and partners, and they are very important to us, and I hope that we do keep them close, but that we have to deal with in, again, a world that is, I think, at least more challenging than at any time since the end of the Cold War, and I would submit and argue maybe any time since the end of World War II. But with that, I'm going to have to exit here with thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Ken, for moderating and living with some of the longest answers. Thanks, Ray, for the subsequent questioning, and thanks to the World Affairs Council overall for the opportunity to do this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
The
you.
Indiana Council wants to thank you, and he's off. We're not going to zip the room. You know, I know some of you still have questions. I want to emphasize that Ken Holland has tremendous. You know, we don't want to just abruptly say goodbye, y'all, and leave. If you'd like to carry on, Ken is also quite capable of answering some questions if you want to have a discussion. So if you'd like to leave, I understand. This has been a great session. First, I think I'm going to go to Janet, who's the president of the ICWA. Just a few words, and then we can perhaps carry on. Janet?
Yes. Well, this evening, we've been part of a timely discussion with General David Petraeus, co-author of the book, Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare. We can all hold our books up. And we've addressed Gaza and now Venezuela. And of course, we very much appreciate the general being with us this evening. I want to thank you, fellow board members, Dr. Kenneth Holland, moderated the discussion, Dr. Betty Tonsing, VP of Programs, hosted this event and arranged for General Petraeus' presentation. Dr. Ray Montagno managed the interactive Zoom with audience Q&A. Thank you. For those who found this presentation to be helpful in understanding world affairs, we have more events that you can be part of. Starting February 3rd, we hope you will join us for our Great Decisions series covering Foreign Policy Association's topics for 2026. These are human rights, foreign policy, tariffs, Africa, nuclear risk, multilateral institutions, and China. And you may order your Great Decisions briefing book at educational discount at the Indiana Council on World Affairs website, which is indianaworld.org. Thank you for being part of this important dialogue today and in the future. Now,